Thank you, Secretary Becerra. I want to start with your attention here on this jar. Do you see this? Do you know what this is?
Looks like candies or snacks.
Unfortunately, the reality is much more grim. These are wristbands that the cartels force people to wear when they cross the border. And if you're not wearing one and you cross the border, the cartels will take a limb or an appendage. This is what these people are forced to wear, and it dictates what cartel they belong to, how much they have paid. And they are absolutely a part of the horrors of trafficking and smuggling that occurs at our southwest border. And I have to point this out because I want to tell the journey, because this has really been laid out in bits and pieces along the way by my colleagues. And we're here to talk about these kids. So if you could turn your attention to the screen real fast, I want to show a quick photo that I took. It was 11:46 at night. I myself took this photo. That little girl that you see was acting terrified, not of the agents, not of myself, but of the man holding her. The very next day at the Donna Processing Facility, we threatened, and I was there to witness this man with a DNA test. He confessed that he actually was not her father, that he had rented her. This is a process called recycling. Now, I know we're here to talk about what happens to these kids after this point, but this little girl was then turned over to HHS custody, your custody, and you've talked at length today about the vetting process, right? And so you now know that this little girl, not through a DNA test, she's not related to that man. She now is in your custody. You have your own case managers who are supposed to vet these processes. And we, of course, know this from the Florida grand jury. These case managers have very little training or no training in interviewing these individuals, particularly children and young children who have been traumatized. You can imagine this man who you just saw on the screen, who, by the way, was a convicted sex offender with this child. You can imagine the trauma that that child had sustained. Your own case managers are not trained in examining, evaluating, or recognizing documents as authentic or fake. She came with no documents. They have no official training when it comes to trauma-informed interviewing skills, no official training when it comes to investigating the safety or legitimacy of addresses to which a UAC may be sent. Now, I don't know what happened to that little girl, but what I do know is that the sponsors that you claim to thoroughly vet, which I would love to get your definition of thorough, because you haven't been able to articulate that here today. It also would include the fact that these kids show up with numbers pinned to their clothes or Sharpied on their bodies to call. Agents have reported in official testimony that these kids have the numbers, the same phone number Sharpied on their arms time and time again. Now, we've heard, of course, of situations where the same sponsor is being called, and magically 20, 30, 40 kids end up with that sponsor. And again, I go back to your statement of we thoroughly vet. You've really emphasized that. Do you vet every member of the household? And does it include an FBI check? Does it include an Interpol check? I would hope that it would, considering that we've had 151 different nationalities cross the southwest border under the Biden administration. But I'm guessing that it doesn't, because only 9% of the UACs are subjected to a DNA test with their sponsor, less than 23% to a background check. And again, I should point out for the record the fact that you release these folks, these kids, to sponsors that are in the country illegally. By definition, they have already broken the law. Is it a standard operating policy to release children into the hands of sponsors in households that haven't been properly vetted and that are here in the country illegally?
I think I heard a question there, and so I'll try to respond because you packed a lot in there, a lot which I think has a lot of misinformation and that I disagree with. I could first start by saying that we do go through a thorough process on assessment of the child when the child first comes to our attention. So that
what
little
is your
girl,
I'm sorry, I'm going to reclaim my time. Secretary, what is your definition of thorough?
I mentioned it in a previous
Does it include
response.
a DNA test?
An assessment of the child's
No, that is not my
situation.
question. My question is, does it include a DNA test, yes or no?
DNA is one of the tools that we use on occasion.
In only 9% of the cases. Does it
is
include a
tool that
background
we
check?
use. We do a number of things to go through a series of tests and assessments of a child when we get them. We do
And a
the same
background
type
check
of
in
vetting.
only 23% of the cases. And the DNA, by the way, that you rely on in your ORR case managers, if you could please pull up Exhibit 2. This shows that the DNA requirements that you rely on in the case files, I realize this is a CBP document, but this memo is something that is really important for what we're talking about, because so much of the case files that your case managers rely on in vetting these thorough checks, they've suspended the DNA requirement. I'm out of time. I know you want to answer the question anyway and deviate from your carefully crafted talking points, but I think this is disgusting that 85,000 children are missing, and it's on your watch. With that, I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. On President Joe Biden's first day in office, dozens of President Donald Trump's common sense policies maintaining our southern border were reversed. Policies like Remain in Mexico, Safe Third Country, Title 42, and border construction was stopped even though the contracts were paid. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies have created a national security and a humanitarian crisis. As a father of a second grader and congressman of the largest military installation in the country, it is heartbreaking and frustrating to see this rapid decline in border security. This administration's open border policies have not only affected our nation's border communities, but all communities, including those in North Carolina. Because of the reversals of these policies, your agency has been overwhelmed. So the decision was made to weaken vetting procedures for sponsors at the expense of the safety of unaccompanied minors and the communities across our nation. As we saw in an investigative report, HHS has undone safeguards in place to make sure children are placed with safe sponsors. The result has been over 85,000 lost children, untold numbers of whom have fallen victim to sex and labor trafficking. Mr. Secretary, you previously sat before me at a health subcommittee hearing on May 12th, 2021. I asked you point blank if you were planning on sending unaccompanied minors to North Carolina. You told me, quote, "There is no plan that we have to shelter children in North Carolina," end quote. But your staff has since informed me that the Office of Refugee Resettlement conducted an initial site visit at the American Hebrew Academy in Greensboro, North Carolina on April 22nd, 3 weeks before your testimony, and that your people actually conducted a full formal site assessment on May 12th. The day of your testimony, your folks were on the ground in North Carolina. Mr. Secretary, it sure sounds like there was a plan to shelter unaccompanied minors in North Carolina. So when I asked you on that day over 2 years ago, how would you characterize your answer to me? Were you intentionally lying to me and the people of North Carolina, or would you say you were carefully choosing your words to mislead me? Would you say you were being clever? What word would you use to describe your answer to me that day?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I hope you'll understand my answer. I was completely honest with you because you asked me if we were planning to send kids to North Carolina. 2 years ago, we didn't have a facility there that we would be sending kids to North Carolina. We go through the constant process, as you probably heard. We look for sites all over the country. We are in 27 states. We're constantly looking for sites. Today, we are looking at a particular site in Greensboro, and that is the absolute truth. So what I said to you then was accurate. What I'm saying to you now, I hope you'll understand, will be accurate as well.
Well, on the day you said there are no plans, your people were doing a formal second site visit in North Carolina.
Congressman, you have to understand the process. We put out a word. We're looking for potential sites. We have no idea what's going to come in. Everyone has an opportunity because we have an open process. Everyone has a chance to show us if they have a good site. At that point in time, we had no idea if there would be a particular site in Greensboro that we could use. There might have been interest, but we still 2 years later, and we still don't have an open site.
So were you carefully using the word plan? We don't have a plan to try to trick me?
No, I was trying to be honest with you. If you ask me about where we are right now with any particular site in Greensboro, I'll give you the details that I can give you today with what I know. But I can't predict. I couldn't have predicted 2 years ago where we would be today. And we still don't have a particular center open in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Okay. We'll agree to disagree on that. But speaking of that, I want to know why we even need this facility in North Carolina. There are 2 influx care facilities in Texas that were placed in warm status, meaning there was no unaccompanied minors in care and minimal facility management services on site. Your staff tells me they plan to move the Greensboro influx care facility into warm status next month. To me, this sounds like your department may be wasting taxpayer dollars on 2 empty facilities in Texas and plan to open yet another one in North Carolina. Mr. Secretary, if 2 facilities in Texas were moved down to warm status, what factors, though, are using to move the Greensboro facility up to warm status? How are you using the same factors to justify 2 contradictory actions?
Congressman, fair question. One of the sites, for example, Fort Bliss, is a military installation. We were able, 2021, when we needed to find places, we essentially stood up a site for kids. But Fort Bliss is not supposed to be a place where you care for kids. We're looking for a more permanent site that is more amenable, accommodating to children. And that's where we put out the call from all over the country. One of those sites that may ultimately go online is in Greensboro, because it is going to be one that we have actually stood up to provide for services to kids, not a military installation.
Okay, well, I'm out of time, but I believe when I asked you 2 years ago, do you have any plans to put children in North Carolina, to be honest with me, rather than saying, well, we don't have a plan, you should have said what you said today, which is we're looking everywhere. We are looking at a site. In fact, my people on the ground today in North Carolina looking, it's possible. I mean, that would have been a more complete, honest answer, I think.
Congressman, you've approached this in a very respectful way, and I hope I can say this respectfully to you. I hope that you'll find, as we develop the relationship, and I hope a friendship, that I will try to be as honest with you as I can.
Well, I look forward to that. Thank you, and I yield
Gentleman
back.
yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion and this public discussion on this very, very important issue. Mr. Secretary, you've inherited a deeply challenging task, and on the heels of the Trump administration's egregious and inhumane family separation policy, you're charged with protecting kids who are increasingly exploited and forced into child labor by U.S. corporations, being forced to work with unsafe machinery and hazardous materials, risking literally life and limb. All of this because of lackluster approach to protecting children by some of my Republican colleagues and the twice impeached president who routinely vilified and mistreated immigrants. Let me be clear, child labor is child abuse, and this needs a strong legislative response at every level. Unfortunately, current child labor protections do not go nearly far enough to deter child exploitations. Corporations, U.S. corporations, find ways to shield themselves from liability by employing third-party contractors, for example. This deserves all of our attention. We need solutions designed to protect children. Meanwhile, child labor laws are being systematically weakened by many Republican legislators at the state level. For example, in at least 10 states, legislation has been proposed to roll back modest child labor protections in an attempt to enable multi-billion-dollar corporations to exploit children right here in America. Immigrant children are getting tangled in barbed wire and drowning in the Rio Grande, Texas. I hope that we hear outrage of that from every single person in Congress. If Republicans are concerned about these kids, they would do everything in their power to make it safer for them to seek asylum. They would make it harder to exploit them and abuse them right here in our own country. Also, one of the solutions that seems to be on the minds of some of my Republican colleagues is claiming that the solution is to the exploitation of unaccompanied minors is to shut down immigration at the southern border. This approach is unconscionable and it's just un-American, and it's also untenable. Unaccompanied children are some of the most vulnerable among us, and the United States has a moral and legal obligation to ensure that those children are safe. I refuse to have us turn our backs on children fleeing war, violence, persecution, and abuse. We can address exploitation by making sure sponsor vetting reflects best practices and equip ORR to provide post-release services, and by having a 60% cut, which is what some of my colleagues want to do, is not a solution at all. But we should not tolerate the simplistic and inhumane proposal that the answer here is to shut down the southern border. It's time for us to get serious about how we can support these children and not inflict unnecessary cruelty on vulnerable children. I have a question for you, Secretary Becerra. How have state laws rolling back child labor protections impeded HHS's ability to serve and protect unaccompanied children after being released from OR custody?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And as you know, in order to be able to enforce laws that protect our children from exploitative labor, we need to have a partnership with our state partners, because it won't be enough to just try to do it through the Department of Labor at the federal level or with HHS. We need to work with our state partners. And if a state is actually diminishing its protections against child labor, it sure makes it tough for us to go out there and enforce against this type of exploitative practice.
I think by diminishing those local laws, it actually encourages bad actors across this country to just even do more. Have there been other efforts at the state level to restrict corporations with OR? If so, what presented the greatest challenges?
Our challenges is trying to make sure we can spot where the exploitative activity will occur, and so we can make sure that any sponsor who wishes to take a child would not engage in that activity in cahoots with those employers. And so the more sight we have on that, working with the Department of Labor, the more likely we'll be able to prevent the child exploitation that occurs.
So Department of Labor at the federal level, but there are also departments of labor at the local level in states, right?
In fact, they're more important because they are on the ground and have greater resources and personnel to try to protect labor laws, especially for children. The department at the federal level, Department of Labor, is very stretched, and we continue to do these partnerships so we can get the best efficiency out of our working together to protect these kids.
Well, I hope Congress gives you more resources to do the job that is needed to be done. My time having expired, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Ms. Harshbarger from Tennessee for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Becerra, for being here. I've got several questions, or mainly yes or no's. The HHS Inspector General wrote in the fall of last year, quote, "Some staff reported that they were hesitant to raise concerns about case management and children's safety due to the fear of retaliation by ORR and facility leadership. In some cases, the reported actions of ORR and facility leadership may have risen to the level of whistleblower chilling." Mr. Secretary, under your leadership, has HHS ever threatened to transfer, remove, suspend, revoke the privileges, or dismiss anyone for raising concerns about ORR sponsors' vetting process? Yes or no?
Congresswoman,
Well, it's just a yes or no, sir.
I do not threaten. We do not threaten.
So that's a no. Would you tolerate, under your watch, suspending, transferring, removing, not promoting, revoking the privileges, or dismissing anyone for raising concerns about ORR policies, procedures, or actions taken?
We have a zero tolerance for any retaliation against whistleblowers.
Okay. The New York Times reported in April this year that an immigration lawyer, Linda Brandmiller, who helped vet sponsors for HHS, had her building access revoked, was fired within hours after emailing HHS about 2 potential sponsors she was concerned could be labor trafficking child migrants. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the committee record the New York Times article dated April 17th, 2023.
And we will take that up at the
Okay.
conclusion, and I assume that we have copies of that.
Yes, yes, you do. Mr. Secretary, is the New York Times article right or wrong
Is it right or wrong about what?
about the question, the statement I just made?
I'm sorry.
About Linda Brandmiller, who helped vet sponsors for HHS, that she had her building access revoked and was fired within hours after emailing HHS about a question about sponsors for labor trafficked child migrants.
As a former Attorney General who worked with and protected whistleblowers, I can tell you that now as Secretary, I do not tolerate on my watch any type of retaliation against whistleblowers.
So I guess you don't know.
Well,
Under
in
her
any-
leadership, was she
Congresswoman, in
threatened to
any
remove?
particular, on a specific case, as you know, I cannot comment on any case that may be
Okay.
before us.
Okay. According to the same New York Times article, Jalen Sibalog, a senior HHS employee and lifelong Democrat, was moved out of her position after she informed congressional staff, the HHS Inspector General, and her bosses that some sponsors were falsifying identities to get unaccompanied migrants released to them. Did that happen, Mr. Secretary? Was she moved out of her position?
Congresswoman, again, we have zero tolerance for any
Well,
retaliation.
it's just a
against
yes or no. If you
whistleblower.
don't know, just say you don't know.
It's that you're asking cases about specific, asking information and questions about a specific case, and as you know, I cannot comment
Okay,
on
no
ongoing
comment.
cases.
According to the New York Times, 2 people who were retaliated against for raising the concerns about sponsors. Do you dispute that New York Times article that under your leadership, HHS retaliated against at least 2 whistleblowers?
Again, I'd have to see this article, but we
Okay.
don't retaliate against whistleblowers.
Okay. so
Not
you
under my
don't know.
watch.
Okay. According to a February 2023 New York Times article, rather than listening to these concerns, you were pressuring HHS employees and contractors to rush more children through the system faster.
That's
According to the
inaccurate.
Times, you were captured on video saying to staff last summer, quote, "If Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line," unquote. Is that how your administration is treating the release of unaccompanied minors, sir, like an assembly line that cannot stop to make sure that these minors are being released to a safe sponsor? And that's a yes or no.
Congressman, you may not have been here earlier. I responded to that question. The information relates to the process we were talking about, not people, when it comes to how we engage in an efficient process to get children where they need to be.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the committee record this February 25th, 2023.
That one's already
New
been
York Times.
requested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Secretary, did you tell former ORR Director Secretary Cindy Huang that you would fire her if she didn't speed up the releases of UAC?
Congresswoman, as I said, I do not we do not tolerate anyone.
So you don't
who tries
know.
to-
Do you know
That's
why
not the-
Director
no, that's not
Hong
accurate.
retired?
That's
Do
not
you know
accurate.
why
I
she
didn't say that I
resigned?
didn't know. I have many conversations with the personnel at ORR. That is not a conversation I had with anyone.
Okay. Due to the surge in unaccompanied alien children arriving under the Biden administration, ORR set up temporary emergency intake sites to deal with demand. According to the HHS Officer Inspector General, one employee at an emergency intake site at Fort Bliss reported retaliation after raising issues about case management and child safety, which caused hesitation among other staff who wished to share concerns. And several staff interviewed by HHS OIG reported knowledge of staff who were allegedly dismissed or reassigned after expressing concerns. This is in addition to media reports of other retaliation against ORR staff and contractors who raised concerns. Are you concerned at all that HHS OIG found instances of retaliation against employees who raised those concerns, sir?
We work closely with the OIG anytime they do a report, and we follow their recommendations usually as quickly as we can. And I can say to you, once again, when it comes to whistleblowing, it is important that we protect those who are willing to come forward for a good, open government. And at HHS, we don't tolerate anyone who would try to retaliate against whistleblowers.